So the reason I wanted to do this, Anne, is because I know you pretty well. We spend time together. But there's a big chunk of the research that you've done over the years that I really don't know much about. And I thought this would be a great opportunity to ask you some questions, and we can share some of what you've done in your professional life with all of us. So thank you for being willing to do that.
Thank you for asking me.
So I'm just going to start with a really broad question, Anne. Tell us about your journey to justice.
Well, simple question. It is great to be here, and what an interesting topic. Journey to justice. Journey to justice. I just think that's a great topic. And I guess, like some of you, many of you, perhaps my journey to justice started at the supper table when I was a kid. But probably different from many of you, my dad was a state legislator. So we did not speak evil of state legislators. We did not bash politicians. We did not rail at the government. I really believed, this is government of the people, by the people, for the people, land of the free, home of the brave. That kind of idea, these ideas about equality and justice and fairness and freedom were very, very important in my family when I was growing up. And also, in a way, I grew up in an unusual place, or I came to understand later that it was an unusual place. My grandparents all homesteaded out in northwest Oklahoma. Pretty bad land. My dad used to say this land should never have been plowed, and he was probably right. But the area that area was homesteaded in the early 1900s. And I'm growing up out there in the 1950s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and so is everyone else. The people who didn't leave during the Dust Bowl, that's who was still there. So there had not been time for great distinctions in wealth or status to have occurred. We were just all there. We were all, the homesteaders of the area. Hardly anyone, once they realized the place, moved in there. People moved out, but they seldom moved in. So my interest in politics started very young. And when I went to college, I majored in political science, and I went on to get a PhD in political science at Indiana University. And I was fortunate, as I think many of us gray-haired folks were, to have grown up in a time of the great social movements of the 20th century. The civil rights movements was starting when I was in high school. And of course, then the anti-war movement, the women's movement, the environmental movement, the gay rights movement, the immigrant rights movement. I've been really privileged to be a part of all of those great social movements, none of which is finished, okay? We're still with it. But to me, all of these social movements were efforts to expand our ideas of justice, equality, freedom, fairness, expand those ideas to a more inclusive set of people, to expand that circle, that boundary that we would draw around who's we the people, right? And expand that boundary so that justice and fairness became something that a lot more people understood. And then my academic career, I became a political scientist, and my focus is on government and public policy, and how can we make democracy work better. There are great forces in this world, I came to realize, that we can't even collectively do anything about except through government, politics, public policy. What can we do about our economy? What can we do about capitalism, the free market, the rough edges of capitalism, except through government and laws to try to restrain and take the rough edges off of an economic system that may not be very fair to a lot of people? What can we do about religion and culture, except through government and public policy and law to try to restrain the excesses when these great forces of religion and culture become oppressive, which they do. So I came to view government not as an enemy or a boogeyman at all, but as the way that we, ordinary people, have to make the world a better place, a more just place, a fairer place. And then during a big hunk of my career, what Barbara mentioned earlier, I switched from being an academic to doing research, evaluation research in a nonprofit, and we studied criminal justice and juvenile justice programs, and I came to be a really big fan of restorative justice. I had to, in that time period, confront what is maybe the core issue of democracy. Democracy has to be a nation. We have to be a nation of laws. We have to have rules. People have to respect one another and obey the rules. What do we do when people don't? What do we do? Because you can't have a society that is run amok. And I had to confront that issue and became a big fan there of restorative justice.
Wow. It's really
That's
cool.
it. Okay, folks, no.
I just want to break in a moment and ask you, and we're going off script here, but I was wondering, was it unusual for a woman to be in political science during that time frame? I
was the only girl in almost all of my classes.
Wow.
Almost all of my classes. Mm-hmm. Then in poli-sci, even in history, there might be a couple of other women, young women. In my econ classes, none. No, I knew a few girls, we thought of ourselves as girls, who were majoring in political science, but it was very unusual. And law schools would not take you at that time. My idea was to go to law school, but girls couldn't go to law school.
Wow. So, imagine that with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Sandra Day
They found
O'Connor.
colleges they could go to. The University of Oklahoma had never taken a woman yet, and Oklahoma State, where I got my undergraduate degree, didn't have a law school.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So, political science, you forged ahead, and you were talking about justice, equality, fairness, expanding the boundary, and interestingly about the necessity of using public policy for that, which I think at least one of the candidates is talking about that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're not naming names here. So tell us more about those big topics of justice and especially fairness and what that means. Okay,
to me, fairness became kind of the guiding philosophical principle of my life, both in my professional life as a political scientist, my personal life. To me, justice is fairness. Fairness is justice. And of course you can say, well, doesn't that just beg the question? You won't tell us what justice is except fairness. Well, then what's fairness? Well, fairness is a nuanced concept, and it depends a lot on the context as to what's fair. I like the work of John Rawls, an American philosopher, who talked about fairness as in two ways that I really like. He talked about equality, and he talked about a veil of ignorance. Veil of ignorance. What if we had no idea when we are born, when we're going to be born, whether we're going to be a male or a female? We don't even know what century it is. We don't know what continent we're going to be born on. We don't know what color we are, okay? We don't have any idea what our talents, if any, what our talents might be. What would we choose? And he says, and the social psychologists have pretty much borne this out, we would choose equality because we don't know behind this veil of ignorance who we are. We would choose equality. And he adds, and I would certainly add, we add to that freedom, because an imposed equality doesn't give the kind of freedom that human beings aspire to. And that's where you come to the idea, at least in my mind, of equality of opportunity. If we could get everyone at the same starting place, which of course we have not done, then people could be free.
So,
And
what do you? Can you say more? And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but can you say more about imposed equality and what's an example of that?
An example of imposed equality really is the Soviet system. In an effort to make sure everyone was really equal, they imposed an equality that sacrificed freedom to an extent that people in this country really just didn't like. We are off script, but I'll tell you a story. Oklahoma used to be very much a socialist place. The mayor of Stillwater was a socialist, and you know, my grandparents started one of the first co-ops. There's co-ops all over. And I asked my dad one time, what happened to socialism in Oklahoma? Why did it just die out? And he said, when they collectivized the farms, when they nationalized the farms, that's when socialism died in Oklahoma, because you could no longer be free, okay, to do what you could with your 160 acres. So equality and freedom, but I wanted to mention also, bring in the idea of fairness. This picks up more from UUism, and that's empathy. I think sometimes empathy is the most undervalued of all human traits. Wow. Empathy leads to compassion. And fairness without compassion just really probably isn't fair. We need compassion. But then we need the third or fourth, whichever it is, thing, and that's fairness requires accountability. For me to be fair to this person, I was a dean at Arizona State for a long time. Fair to this person who insists that they really deserve a raise, to be fair to them. How am I going to be fair to these other 100 people out here who may also think they deserve a raise and I can't give them a raise? And they're not in my office lobbying me for it, okay? So fairness requires accountability. Accountability to a public interest, and accountability for people who break the law. That's what I was talking about earlier, who break the law. People who break the rules, people who harm others. That was the idea of restorative justice as a possibility.
Right. And I want to backtrack just a bit. You had, in part of your opening comments, you were also talking about religion and culture, and how that is also part of justice, equality, and fairness. And we're off topic here, but what else can you say about that? Religion
and culture impacts our lives in extraordinary. How many of you here were raised as UUs? One of the interesting things about UUism is that we broke from that. If you went to most churches, Methodist churches, Catholic churches, and I asked that question, 90% of the people there would hold up their hand. You raised a Catholic, etc., right? And it's not just Christians, you know, Muslims. All religions have this enormous impact on people. And our beliefs and religions become very spiritual. It means they also become very emotional, right? And we can, in fact, let that run away with us, and religions can become oppressive. How do we rein in and take the rough edges off and give people freedom? We have to also, through public policy, we have to limit the oppressiveness that even if it's religion or culture that imposes on us. Otherwise, people can't really be free at all. And I'm not anti-religious. I'm not being that here at all. It's just that is a huge cultural system. So is our economic system. And that, to me, is where justice comes in. We need a government that is just, because that's how it is through government, laws, public policy, that we can create a just society. Yeah, so that's interesting, because one of the big topics in this year's campaign has been, so-and-so has a background in business, and that's a good thing. And so, but what you're saying is that government isn't a business, and it's a democracy. It's a democracy, and yet it does create public policy for businesses to be able to function. Exactly, and one of the most important things, business couldn't function if we didn't have a system of laws and contracts. It couldn't function. So government and laws and policy has to function for everyone, but it has to, as I said, take the rough edges off of capitalism.
And that's part of what you're saying in policy and creating those policies from a just and fair perspective.
Right.
So that business can happen equally. Those are lots of really big terms, like noble terms that are hard to define.
Rose-colored glasses.
Rose-colored glasses. But you had just briefly talked about restorative justice. So what is restorative justice and how does it work?
Well, I got very interested in this when I was doing that research. Our traditional juvenile and criminal justice systems operate along a continuum. Punishment over here, lock them up, throw away the keys, and then over here, rehabilitation, and of course the conservatives call us bleeding heart liberals, all right, and this continuum. Here you're trying to do something, this system is trying to do something for the offender, and over here you're trying to do something to them. Restorative justice doesn't even lie along that continuum. It's a different principle of justice. And it's a principle of justice where the offender is expected to do something for the victim. Pay restitution, do community service. The idea is the offender is supposed to admit they were wrong, acknowledge what they did wrong, say that they're sorry, understand the harm they have done to a victim, and then pay restitution or do community service insofar as is possible to restore the victim. And in doing so, they restore themselves. I'm too close to the mic. Is this ringing yours? They restore themselves to their rightful place in society. And that's why it's called restorative justice, that the offender and the victim ideally reach an agreement on what a fair sanction would be. And the offender does that, and then both have been restored. That's the idea. South Africa modeled this in their Truth and Reconciliation panels, and we did a nationwide study on this in juvenile courts, and it was something that can really work, not just for, throwing a rock through a window, but it can work for much more serious kinds of crimes. It doesn't always restore, it doesn't always work, but that's the idea of it.
So, in this idea of restorative justice, have you actually worked in? Do you have an actual example of where it worked?
Yeah, we had many examples. In fact, we took some kids. We studied 85 courts around the country, and we took some kids who were participating in these restitution community service programs and testified at Congress. And these kids talked about things like, okay, here's a kid who had at 15 become a burglar, okay, and he in fact is routinely burglarizing homes in his neighborhood. And, he's on his way toward the penitentiary. And instead of locking him up again, he went through this program. And the victims, not all of them, but some of them would actually come and say, look, you messed up. You scared the dickens out of me. I don't feel safe in my home anymore. You stole antique pieces of jewelry and then pawned them. Those belong to my grandmother. And some of the victims actually let these kids work for them. Now, that's going, way beyond the call of duty, but some of them actually did. So these kids testified how it changed their life.
Wow.
It would make you cry.
So, and you mentioned also that South Africa was able to have a form of restorative justice in their Truth and Reconciliation. What are some of the issues that might happen for us in the U.S. in applying this notion of reparation for slavery?
Reparations, that's such an interesting idea. restorative justice works best if you have a real offender over here whose behavior actually caused this harm to this victim over here. Well, and with slavery, there are victims of slavery still today, of course. Slavery and then compounded with the kind of discrimination. But you don't have the same, it's not the same kind of dynamic as when this person actually did X and this person suffered from it. So it's not the same kind of dynamic. And yet, the idea, I think reparations, I think clever people ought to be able to figure out a way to do this. The United States actually did reparations for the Japanese who had been interned. And Congress, a couple of different times, has passed resolutions apologizing for slavery. Unfortunately, they've kind of watered it down every time by saying, well, you can't use this as a legitimate justification for reparations. So reparations gets very, very complicated. And believe me, the devil is in the details. Because I can just hear the descendants of a Union soldier, for example, saying, what, me, pay reparations? We fought a war to end slavery. What, me? You know, my great-great-great-grandfather died in that war to end slavery. Why do you expect me to pay reparations? I already paid. We already paid. We fought a war to end slavery. But then I can hear someone else saying, but slavery was a collective injustice. It was the law of the land. This society owes the descendants of slaves and black people throughout this society owes for the harm that has been done. And then I can see someone saying, well, children aren't responsible for their sins of their parents, are they? Well, no, not really. But on the other hand, this was a collective injustice, societal injustice. Don't we owe something? So, as I say, the devil, well, and in restorative justice, the parties tend to try to come together and reach an agreement. And unfortunately, the opinion polls of white people are very much opposed to reparations. So the devil is in the details. Restorative, I think clever people with good hearts could figure out a way to do this. I just really do. But the devil is in details, and I'll admit, every time I try to kind of think my way through it, and figure out how could we actually do this, I just sort of run up against,
some challenges.
Some real challenges.
Yeah, and of course, today we're not here to solve that problem.
Oh.
But I think certainly it's interesting to talk about it, especially given the purposes and principles of Unitarian Universalism, which are certainly rooted in all these words that we use that where the definition changes over the course of time, and as we grow in our expanding the boundary, as you say, of justice, equality, and fairness. And so what do these lofty and romantic notions, ideas of justice and fairness, and even restorative justice have to do, what's their meaning for Unitarian Universalism?
I think that's one of the things that really attracted me to Unitarian Universalism. We ought to be the champion of justice and fairness. And some of the things we can do, though, journey to justice. What's your journey to justice? And what do you think justice is? Like I say, fairness to me is the cornerstone, the core of what justice means. But then I have to think about what does fairness mean, as I said. And there's many facets, and it's nuanced, and it changes from one situation to another. But we can reflect on that, and we can think, how inclusive is our own circle? How inclusive is our own circle of fairness? Equality to whom? How far do we extend these ideas? And I'd like to point out that fairness and justice are positive concepts. They're positive concepts. And they are both emotional or spiritual, okay? And they're also rational. And don't let us let go of our reason, our rationality, our logic. When we're trying to decide what is fair in some context, we need to get the facts straight. Get the facts straight first and try to reach some agreement on what those are, because otherwise we're all just flailing. About. But I think we can work on our own UU principles, inherent worth and dignity of every person, respect for and participation in the democratic process. And we need to let go of the name calling. I'm not going to talk about the election, but I will. Name calling, hatefulness, okay, total disregard at times for what's factual, constantly misleading. These are kinds of things that democracy and justice can't survive this kind of thing. So people like us, we need in our self, our workplace, our family, our neighborhood, we need to work on the ideas, in my mind, of fairness, compassion, equality, respect, because we can help make this a better world.
Yes, certainly. That's what I believe about the Unitarian Universalist purposes and principles, that it is an opportunity for being able to make changes to human behavior, to humankind, sort of like the Declaration of Independence, if it is something to achieve, not something that has already happened.
It's something out there, as they say, the arc of history bends toward justice, but it seems to me justice walks with steps that are measured and slow. And it balances. It has to balance equality with freedom. It balances compassion with accountability. Mm-hmm. It balances my interests with your interests. And it walks in that great middle ground between the extremes.
What are those extremes?
Sometimes any of us become so passionate that we are right. Now, UUs are not as bad about this as others. So passionate that we are right, that we are certain our way is the right way, that we are inclined like the little boy to pick up the bat and ball and take it and go home and destroy the game, rather, if I can't get my way. We have to recognize other people have interests too.
Yeah, do I hear a little tenderness in your voice?
No, of course not. But I do feel really, we can make our democracy grow better.
Yes, so we can grow into the possibility of democracy.
That's right. And my co-author, Helen Ingram, and I have worked on that in our professional life. Policy design for democracy. How do we design policies that serve democracy? We've called our democracy a degenerative democracy, that in some ways every round gets worse than the last. How do we get out of this degenerative cycle and move, toward a more just society?
Toward generative.
Yes.
Yes.
Society that's fair.
Well, Anne, thank you so much for taking time. Does anyone have a question they'd like to ask Anne?
We've got a couple of minutes.
Okay.
Okay, did you know I got stung by a scorpion this morning? I just thought I would close with that. I did. I got stung right on my little finger here. How many of you have ever been stung by a scorpion?
Okay, shut it down.
Living in... I'm sorry.